Hello everyone, it's Super Mario Carl here, and we'll be reading part 4 of All Tomorrows. And well, this time you won't have to wait 2 years for it, and part 5 will be coming relatively soon as well. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications so you can watch part 5 as soon as you can. Alright, let's get into it. Pterosapiens, descendants of the Flyers. The Flyers' supercharged hearts had given them an evolutionary winning hand, and they diversified to fill up the heavens. It was only a time before the competition in the skies got too intense, even for their souped-up metabolisms. Some lineages gave up their wings and returned to the ground, living as differing sorts of predators, herbivores, and even swimmers. Their aerial adaptations gave them an edge on the ground, and they produced forms of stupendous size and agility. There were wonderful beings, but no sentience came out of the terrestrial sky beasts. Instead, civilization flowered in the skies. One species from a line of waiting stork-like predators evolved a brain that was large enough to imagine and act upon the world. Their feet, already versatile to catch the slippery swamp-dwelling prey, got even more articulate and assumed the role of hands. As a compensation, they lost some of their aerial streamlining, but what they could not do with their bodies, they were more than able to make up with their minds. Their power of flight made the Pterosapiens a global folk. Before they could invent nations and borders with such an inherent ease of travel, ideas and individuals diffused too fast for social differences to ossify. Acting with a planetary awareness, they farmed their gigantic terrestrial relatives, raised cities of perches and fluting towers, harnessed the atom and began to gaze up to the stars without having to compensate too much from the average individual's welfare, and without dividing up into quarrelsome factions. As egalitarian as their life seemed, they paid in a stunning, inevitable price. Their hearts, even in their boosted states, had trouble supporting their power of flight and grotesquely large brains at the same time. As a consequence, they had an ephemeral lifespan. A Pterosapien was sexually mature at 2, middle-aged by 16, and usually dead by 23 years of our time. This grim cycle caused them to appreciate every moment of their existence dearly, and they pondered upon it with feverish intensity. A shelf of scrolls by Pterosapien philosophers would have been the envy of every human library. In their cities, life blazed away with unreal speed, rushing past to meet fleeting deadlines. As a species, the angelic flyers were victims of heart disease. A Pterosapien poses by the bizarre buildings of a seaside resort. At 10 days long, this will be the only holiday in her ephemeral life. Asymmetric people, descendants of the Lopsiders. Although contorted by gravity, the Lopsiders managed to regain their sentience and develop a civilization in a short few million years. Squat, pancake-like buildings spread all over their planet. These constructs looked like squashed bunkers, and they were never more than a few meters high. They did not seem like much, but such structures were entrances to underground homes, schools, hospitals, temples, universities, but also embassies, prisons, asylums, command centers, and arsenals. They lived strange lives, but the Lopsiders were human in all of their virtues and evils. Thus, it was only natural for them to expand outwards and look for new frontiers to colonize. Fortunately, their solar system harbored other planets, similar to the Lopsider homeworld in almost all respects except gravity, but they weren't willing to let such trivial details stop them. Throughout their history, humans had always risked changing themselves to preserve their future. It was a risky gamble, but it had paid off since the days of the Martian Americans. But re-engineering the flattened lopsider body for a benign gravity was a monumental task indeed. Suffice it say that the experiments took millennia to achieve even limited success. After countless attempts, the asymmetric people were born, or rather made. Their bodies were changed considerably. What had been shovel-like toes to slither through the high-gravity dirt had become centipedal legs, and the singular grasping hand was elongated to an extreme degree. Their grotesque faces had been inverted and turned upside down after reverting from a flounder-like existence. Twisted as they were, members of this new race enjoyed tremendous advantages over their flattened forefathers. Their social development was also paralleled that of the bygone Martian Americans. Once again, there was a golden age followed by increasing tensions and interplanetary war. But unlike the Martians, the asymmetrics ruthlessly exterminated their parent race and went on to rule the solar system alone. On the way, they stumbled across the remains of the Ku and the Star People and advanced immensely. Triumphant on their own realm, they turned to the heavens for further exploits. An asymmetric nobleman poses nude to reveal his bizarre anatomy. Normally, these creatures dress up in elaborate garments that resemble heaps of interconnected, enlarged stockings. Symbiotes, descendants of the parasites. As time passed, the relationships between the parasites and their hosts got connected to such a degree that it began to involve a cooperation of the individuals. These were no longer single-sided relationships in advance for the host's nutritious blood. The parasites offered their heightened sense of an early warning against predators and other hazards. A great arms race of symbiotic relationships thus commenced. Certain parasites offered their hosts larger eyes, others sharper senses of smell, hearing, or even additional defensive weapons in the shape of venomous saliva, malodorant sprays, or an extra bite. These hosts returned the favor with longer running legs, stronger bodies, and specialized ergonomic nesting sites, rich in blood vessels and covered in insulating fur. Different complexes of parasite and host species evolved, compatible only amongst themselves. The development of such creatures was in a way reminiscent of the great modular colonies, thriving on their own world light years away. But unlike the modulars, the components of the symbiotes belonged to different species instead of modified variations of the same basic organism. In eventuality, both relationships led to the same point: sentience. In the secluded forests of a certain continent, a new parasitic species developed. They did not have the ballistic poison sprays, infectious stings, or the grossly hypertrophied arm claws of their relatives. Instead, these parasites offered a simpler bargain: an ability to think in return of total submission. Initially, this relationship was more like a horse and its rider, but after a few 100,000 years, the symbiotes could manipulate their hosts like puppet through a combination of tactile and olfactory signals. A few more millennia, and these combined beings developed an order not unlike our own, complete with countries, politics, and even war, albeit reduced to a newly globalizing world culture. In this age, technology filled most of the functions of the hosts, but a thriving husbandry of these creatures still remained due to tradition and simple efficiency. An average symbiote would begin the day on its business host and move on to a more comfortable domestic one when he returned home after work. And perhaps on the olfactory television, he would smell news of excavations of the million-year-old Ku ruins, of the marvelous discoveries salvaged from starmen wrecks, or of the enormous radio arrays that rose everywhere to listen to the stars. It was a pattern that was being repeated all over. A symbiote poses on one of his several hosts. In the background can be seen some of their rural housing, with man-sized doors for the mindless hosts and smaller hosts for their intelligent patrons. Sail people, descendants of the finger fishers. The finger fishers were already among the most divergent of the post-human races, with harpoon-like digits and almost crocodilian muzzles. They looked nothing like their parental stock, but even this form would look conservative to their sentient descendants. With many small, scattered islands, isolated subcontinents, and differentiated niches, their homeworld was an evolutionary cauldron, where isolated members of a certain species could, under the right circumstances, evolve into wildly different forms. This condition was similar to the island realms of Madagascar, Galapagos, or Hawaii on old Earth, except that on this time it was on a global scale. Some descendants of the fishers, trapped on lonely islands, grew smaller and developed their fishing claws into graceful wings. Others took directly to the sea and became the analogues of whales, dolphins, and mosasaurs. With this evolutionary bubbling, one particular lineage gave rise to the ancestral sail people. They too elongated their fingers into wings, but they were not used for flight. Instead, they became sails that drove them effortlessly across the oceans. With fingers turned into sails, they used their mouths and extended tongues to catch their pelagic prey. These organs eventually assumed the roles of the fishers. Long, atrophied, dexterous hands, the need to better navigate the endless seas put an inevitable pressure on their memories, and the sailors' brains grew correspondingly. It was only a matter of time until one of these navigators became smart enough to think. Even when sentient, the sail people still needed a long time to achieve any sort of social stability. Their scattered world made from a tremendous diversity of cultures, when competed and fought just as resiliently. Across generations, untold flotillas of tribal warriors battled each other in an epic-spanning, pointless conflicts. Nomadic warriors and pirate societies inevitably came into being, prolonging the uncontrollable cycle of violence. Only when a certain warrior tribe developed warfare on an industrial scale and the state society needed to support it, and then only when this notion of modernity gave rise to an idea of peace, did the sail people finally manage to unify. Generations of blood had stained the oceans for far too long. A sailor goes hunting with his harpoon-wielding companion in the background. Extremely violent by nature, these people frequently resorted to savage hunting campaigns to quell their bloodlust in modern life. Notice their tongue-derived hands and the accompanying flying creature, actually one of the sail people's distant cousins. Satyriacs, descendants of the hedonists. Their pleasure-drenched existence, locked between their static paradise world and their inherently slow pace of evolution, seemed immune to change. Perhaps this was true for 1,000,000 years or so, but on large scales, complete stasis was a fable. During a particular era, geologic upheavals threw up huge masses of land over the shallow oceans of their world. The hedonists, until then trapped on Singular Island, no bigger than today's Iceland, were not late to colonize these new pastures. This was more of a necessary exodus, since the events that raised the new lands had also thrown up enormous clouds of ash that smothered the atmosphere and blocked out the sun. Their innocence finally spoilt, most of the hedonists died out, unable to adapt. The only survivors were fast-breeding freaks who had abandoned the reproductive quirks of their ancestors. It was these forms that colonized the newborn continent and gave rise to a multitude of species, which include the Satyriacs, sentient heirs to the hedonists. These beings resembled their ancestors to a great degree, except they now sported enormous tails, boneless organs of balance woven out of extended pelvic muscles and fat. Along this appendage, their entire bodies were reoriented in horizontal, almost dinosaurian postures. Although they had abandoned the frantic reproductive strategies of their ancestors, their social lives still retained a delightful tint of casual promiscuity. The Satyriac civilization was quick to develop itself globally, for even with the additional land masses, the terrestrial domain of their world remained no larger than Australia. For a while, 3 and then 2 land empires competed each other, before dissolving into a myriad smaller nations and finally reunifying into a coherent world order. From this point on, the Satyriac world once became a Valhalla of pleasure, with festivals, concerts, and ritualized orgies punctuating every working week. This time, however, it could all be savored by true intelligence. Satiric audiences go wild as the performer hits the climax of his song. Such events are an everyday part of the satiric life. Bug facers, descendants of the insectophagi. Over time, their insectivorous ancestors came to resemble their prey. Hardened, leathery faceplates, once used for defense against stings and bites, ossified and became integrated into the jaw structure. Their hands and feet, with reduced numbers of fingers and toes, developed into pincer-like affairs. Even their metabolism reverted partially into ectothermy in the balmy, lazy climate of their planet. But it was none of those adaptations that gave them the edge in survival. Simply put, a congenital defect allowed them to retain their existence. Even after their smothering by the coup, the genes of the star people remained dormant in their cells. Through pure coincidence, one lineage of this insectophagi developed an atavistic throwback, resulting in larger brains, which just happened to be useful in cracking open insect nests with crude stone tools. It was an easy ride from there on, although millennia long in itself. The development from stone axe to spaceship was an eye blink in geological time. Like many other species, the bug facers passed through consecutive cycles as agrarian, in their case high farming empires, colonial endeavors, industrialization, massive world wars, and finally globalized world states. But there was one thing that set their development apart from all other post-human species. They faced another alien invasion. History does not record much about their invaders, except that unlike the coup, theirs was a singular effort, and it was beaten off in an intense cycle of orbital and terrestrial wars. Although vanquished, the invaders did succeed in leaving behind their traces. They introduced their own flora and fauna, which flourished on the bug facer home planet long after they departed. More importantly, they imbibed the poor bug facers with pathological interspecies xenophobia, to the point that they were fearful of even the post-human cousins on other stars. Through an ironic twist of fate, their fears would become more than justified, though not just yet. The bug facers still had time. A bug-faced celebrity, arguably the most beautiful girl on their planet, poses before a coastal village. In the distance can be seen gas bag-like tree creatures, relics left over from the mysterious alien invaders. Asteromorphs, descendants of the Spacers. Initially refugees, the Spacers were quick to master the vastness of interstellar space. Their isolated space arcs joined together and multiplied to form a gigantic interlocked artifact that was large enough to contain entire worlds. But no planet lay aside from the asteromorph capital, only cavernous, gravity-free bubbles where the inhabitants could finally develop to their fullest. Freed from the constraints of weight, their bodies grew spindly and insectile, with individuals' digits extending into multitudes of thin, versatile limbs. Other than these, the only developed organs were their derived jet sphincters, which went on to become the principal means of locomotion, but above all were their brains, their bulging, swollen brains. With no hindrance from gravity, the human brain could grow into unprecedented sizes. Each generation devised experiments that would produce offspring with greater cranial capacity, giving rise to beings who went through their everyday lives thinking in concepts and structures scarcely comprehensible to the people of today. The physiological limitations of the human mind had been long since debated. Now it was established that these limits were indeed real, and individuals who could break them would likewise conquer new grounds in philosophy, art, and science. Everything changed. Yet some aspects of humanity, such as the basic desire to expand, remained. To this end, the asteromorphs built great fleets of globular subarcs and spread their influence across the heavens. Into every stellar cluster and every star system, within less than 1,000 years, the galaxy was straddled by new and far more alien empire of man. Strangely enough, its dominion included none of the newly emerging post-human species, for its masters had completely lost interest in planets, those stunting gravity-chained balls of dirt and ice. The newborn arcs settled comfortably in the outer rims of star systems, quietly observing the lives of their struggling relatives. For the first time in history, there were actual gods in the myriad human skies. They were silent and weren't even noticed most of the time, but their watchfulness was ultimately going to pay off. Second Galactic Empire. Over time, the sentient post-humans began to reach out to the galaxy. They inevitably stumbled across the ruins of the Starmen and figured out their interstellar ancestry. These discoveries were followed by a realization that there might be others like them, unimaginable distance away. Thus, the fledgling civilizations set out to probing the skies. The contacts, all established by radio communication, were not spread out evenly. The empire began little more than a few million years after the coup left, with the first dialogue between the earliest killer folk and the Satyriaks. A few thousand years later, they were joined by the tool breeders, hailing out from the ocean depths through living radio arrays. The second wave of sentient species joined in during the following 10 million years, as the modular whole, Pterosapiens and fledgling asymmetrics contacted their celestial cousins. Finally, in the next 20 million years, newly evolving civilizations, such as the Sauros, snake people, parasite symbiotes, and the Sail people successively contacted the burgeoning galactic empire. The bug facers were aware of the whole process, but due to their xenophobic experience, they only opened up after a staggering 40 million years of silence. The Union was an empire of speech, for actual travel between the stars was too difficult to be practical. Like the bygone colonies of the Starmen, the post-humans cooperated through the unrestricted exchange of information and experience, although covering every aspect of an astounding variety of creatures. The Empire's efforts focused on two main issues: political unification, though not homogenization, and galactic awareness, constant readiness for possible alien invasions. Everybody had come across the remains of the mysterious coup. Nobody wanted a repeat of the same scenario. When the Second Empire ran into the Asteromorphs, who had silently saturated the galaxy with their own empire of man, they feared the worst. But luckily for them, the godlike beings were not interested in the Second Empire, nor any of its worlds. The Asteromorphs were given wide berth, and accepted as they were incomprehensible, omnipotent forces of nature. This coordinated effort lasted for almost 80 million years, during which its member species attained previously unimaginable levels of culture, welfare, and technology. Each species colonized a few dozen other worlds of their own, in which nations, cultures, and individuals lived to the fullest potentials of their existence. Needless to say, all of this was possible only through constant communication and a total openness to the galaxy. Most communities took this for granted and dutifully participated in the galactic dialogues, but there were others, silent, darkened beings who refused to join in. Through them would come the ruin of the Empire. Gravitol, descendants of the ruin haunters. After the lesson of the coup, Second Galactic Empire kept a constant watch against alien invasion. Ironically, they neglected to look among themselves. The second great invasion of the galaxy came not from outside, but from within. The ruin haunters, who were lucky enough to inherit the secrets of the Starmen and coup when other species were mere animals, had experienced a tremendous advance in their technological prowess. All in all, they were as sophisticated as, if not more, than the Asteromorphs of the Void. But their ascendancy was not a sane one. Recall that most ruin haunters were already deranged with a twisted assumption of being the sole inheritors of the Starmen. They refused to communicate with their relatives on other planets and kept to their own affairs. The neurotic hubris assumed truly dangerous proportions after the ruin hunters modified themselves. The origin of this modification laid in an earlier catastrophe. The ruin hunter's sun was undergoing a rapid phase of expansion, and the species, advanced as it was, could do nothing to stop the process. So the haunters did the next best thing and changed their bodies. The infernal conditions of the solar expansion meant that a biological reconstruction was totally out of the question. Thus, the haunters replaced their bodies with machines, floating spheres of metal that moved and molded their environment through subtle manipulations of gravity fields. In earlier versions, spheres still cradled the organic brains of the last haunters, but in successive generations, ways of containing the mind within quantum computers were devised, and the transformation became absolute. The ruin haunters were replaced by the completely mechanical gravital. While not even organic, the gravital still retained human dreams, human ambitions, and human delusions of grandeur. This, combined with mechanical bodies that allowed them to cross space with ease, made interstellar war a frightening possibility.